Welcome to Testing in the Pub.
Welcome to Testing in the Pub, where we are in
Whitehall Gardens.
Whitehall Gardens. It's quite nice down here.
Yeah, on the banks of the River Thames. So it's actually testing in the park rather than testing in the
park
pub today.
Testing in the park, I like it. Without beer today.
Indeed, alfresco.
Next time we need to bring beer, so it's testing in the
You probably find it's illegal
park.
to drink beer in this park or something.
Is it?
This is London. I've no idea.
It's not illegal in Scotland, but hey,
It's
it says a lot.
actively encouraged, possibly.
Yeah, only if you're underage. Okay, so today we're going to talk about non-functional requirements.
Non-functional requirements. The bane of many projects, or the bit that gets ignored.
What does it even mean? Like, WTF is NFR?
Oh yeah, Dan, you're so down with the kids.
Brilliant.
What does it mean? In my head, if somebody says non-functional requirements to me, I think of things like security and performance, and maybe I think a little bit about stress and load, and then I wonder actually what's the difference between performance, stress and load anyway.
Yeah. Stress and load and speed constitute as performance, right?
Potentially, although there's an argument that says load and stress are more related to how many users your site can possibly support, or how many users you choose to either, for example, throw at your site in a particular time period.
Yeah, sure. It's like performance against concurrent users, as in load or stress, right? So load is a consistent concurrent users over a set period of time, but stress is when you increase that user load to the point of failure.
Yeah,
that's what I understand.
So where does performance fit in that then?
Well, that is performance. You're investigating the performance under those conditions. But whereas speed could be a single user, it's like page load times and things like that, where it's completely different tools that you would use. Yeah,
or response time and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
But then, you've got security. You've got possibly, I've worked in a company where they classed localization as a non-functional requirement. That's debatable.
That's massively debatable, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
If you think about it, if I'm in the language that you choose to not support by default, and therefore you choose to, I guess, inherently localize, then I can't functionally use your website or your application if I don't understand, I don't know, English, for example.
It's very true, and also obviously you're going to have some sort of functionality around about changing the language, right? So how that can be labelled as non-functional is beyond me. But it's the same with accessibility as well. Some people label accessibility as non-functional. But then, is any of this testing really non-functional? It's all functional really, but it's just a different label to categorise it.
It is. Maybe it's a little bit like the manual versus call it something else label.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that comes down to the terminology as well. Well, we know that James Back and Michael Bolton used, was it parafunctional?
Parafunctional, yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, that's strange. Or there's quasi-functional as well, I think one of them uses.
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit like, I don't know, I think you were there when we tried to rename manual testing to sapient testing at one point. Yeah. That didn't exactly go swimmingly, did it?
I know, it's because there's people feel uncomfortable when they hear terminology like that, because straight away they don't know what it means. But even with terms like non-functional, it's like, well, okay, potentially we know what people mean by that when they say non-functional, right? We can ask the question, do you mean security or performance? But if we were to call it quasi-functional, they wouldn't even know what to ask.
No,
It's kind of...
If you called it quasi-functional, I would think of Quasimodo. But there you go.
That's true. Okay, so let's talk. We've spoke about kind of what NFR or non-functional requirements are, or parafunctional, or whatever.
Or what they could be, or what people have understood them to be, rightly or wrongly.
So, where do we incorporate this? Because I'm thinking about, there's an element of a lot of these that I do as part of exploratory testing, right? But should it all be done as part of exploratory testing, or?
So it's a good question, isn't it? It's what's traditionally happened. Traditionally, this stuff has either been forgotten about entirely, hastily tacked on the end of a project, sometimes after the thing's been released, or in fact quite frequently after the thing's been released, or sometimes it's spawned an entire new industry, hasn't it? Let's be perfectly honest.
Well, yeah, it's true. You see so many projects. Thinking about it, that's really true. You see so many projects that have gone out the door, and then you might get an external penetration tester in to do some security testing on a product that's already out there, right?
Yep.
And that's a separate team, but at the same time, I try and incorporate some security testing as part of my exploratory testing. But I guess there's a skills thing. Should testers be involved at the same level of security testing as a penetration tester?
And I suppose the same applies for, say, performance testing as an example. I mean, performance testing, you're much more likely to be using an automated tool and interacting in very much more detail with the software. So is that something that you could call a testing activity? Would you use testers to do that testing activity? Would you use specialized performance testers, or would you just consider it something that is part of good development, irrespective of who does it?
That's very true. And that comes also back to the terminology of performance, right? Because personally, I think that testers should be thinking about things like speed, at least, right?
Yeah.
Even if it's a single user, if something takes 20 seconds to load and you're feeling frustrated, you should use that as part of your testing, right? You should recognise that and raise concerns or speak to people, right?
Absolutely. It's that kind of, is there a problem here?
Yeah, exactly.
I always have that quote from Michael Bolton in my head when I'm looking at things like that. It's, am I ultimately feeling something like, as you say, frustration, which can be a good indicator that something could be too slow.
Yeah. Have you worked in any teams that have incorporated this as part of exploratory testing, or?
I haven't, if I'm perfectly honest. I mean, most recently, I've spent a lot of time with the team doing a lot of performance testing, although that was primarily development-driven activity. So,
Right.
because the nature of the tools that were being used to test for that performance and the nature of the infrastructure that was being spun up to support that, it was far more efficient to use some developers within the team who had those skills already to do that sort of testing, rather than to upskill the testers.
Yeah.
Well, that was a very specific case and running very much up to the launch of a brand new platform. So we were not blessed with a huge amount of time to do anything.
So you're talking about concurrent users here, right? With specific tools and automation around that.
Yeah, well, essentially, yeah, and I'm talking about stressing a new system, so pushing a system way beyond what you expect the user load is likely to be, in order to give yourself confidence that when you launch the platform, you're not going to have a massive peak in users and the whole thing's going to fall over, and then you blow all that goodwill and you blow all that marketing that you've put around any brand new launch.
Yeah, you've touched on something there, which is kind of like the requirements side. So NFR, right? The big R stands for requirements, right? But it's kind of, when you're talking about level of acceptability, expected user amount. So that's kind of something that kind of has to be defined up front, or does it? Can we do all this investigation, put all this effort in, and then turn around and say it breaks at this amount of users, right?
I think it's one of those things, like so much of testing. You need to understand your customer or understand your user, and so you need to understand the space that the software you're testing is launching into. So take this particular example. We looked at the space we were launching into. We looked at similar platforms, and we looked at their likely load, and we based our load testing on that. You've got to base it on something. Ultimately, I think that's the really key point. It has to be based on something, and that something has to be realistic. So you have to understand your users, or you have to understand the market that you're going to launch into.
Yeah.
But that's no different from any other sort of testing in that sense. It's just the particular thing you're understanding is different.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, so traditionally it's been separate, maybe a separate team or even a third-party company, right, getting involved, particularly with performance and security. Maybe not so much with accessibility or things like localization, if you can class that as NFR, right?
Yeah, accessibility is a really funny one actually, because I work in the mobile app space a lot, and there's one thing at the moment that I've seen that's been driving better accessibility within iOS, and that's actually been test automation. So Appium, as an example, Appium uses accessibility labels to be able to easily identify objects in the UI of a particular app. So I've certainly seen a couple of teams who've actually gone through and put proper accessibility labels in an app, not because they were really thinking about accessibility, but because they suddenly needed a way of automating. Accessibility labels seem to be the way to do it, and they said, oh, well, while we're putting the accessibility labels in, we may as well make them sensible.
That's really interesting because they've not really been thinking about accessibility, but more testability, right?
They've been thinking about testability, but testability has driven accessibility purely because if you're going to put an accessibility label in, you should give it the team rapidly come around to thinking, well, it should be a sensible accessibility label.
Yeah.
Bingo, there's accessibility for you.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. But I guess it's different for web apps or websites, right? Because well, you still have that element of accessibility stemmed from testability if you're using if you have to integrate with third party like text to speech software, right?
Yeah.
But for things like accessibility, I'm also thinking about, well, with mobile, you're thinking about like text size, things like that, right?
Yep.
Well, that won't necessarily be covered by the automation side.
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't be. And yeah, you could be thinking about what happens if you ramp the text size right up, for example.
What happens if someone has massive fingers as well?
Yeah, I mean that's something I would expect a good exploratory tester to be looking for.
Yeah, yeah. So that's where I'm saying there's a kind of a crossover between what is incorporated as part of ET and what is incorporated as part of this sort of traditional method when it comes to NFRs. Like,
yeah. There's definitely sensible crossover, and there certainly shouldn't be as much separation as there has traditionally been.
Yeah. So maybe accessibility and localization are bad examples then, right? Thinking about security, right? Where I know a lot of testers that are involved in security testing to a degree, but I know plenty that aren't, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they don't look at the web traffic or something like that, or maybe they don't look at the system that they're testing from that security point of view, like even thinking about WASP top 10 security vulnerabilities, right?
It always surprises me how many testers don't know how to use a proxy.
Yeah. I know that it's not necessarily a security tool.
It's not.
That's the thing. It's like
not.
It's a tool that provides some fantastic information on your testing, right?
Yeah.
And also I use it for test data setup.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
So yeah, I'm surprised by that as well. But using it for security, do you think if people pick that tool up more as a test tool rather than a security tool, then they might be inclined to learn more about security then?
I think they probably would, because if anything, it just gives you that ability. Once you understand how easy it is to intercept network traffic and just to kind of peek at it and play with it, then I think that can open your eyes to just how easy some of that stuff actually is. I think there's been a bit of a problem whereby most non-functional requirement testing, whether it's security or performance, it's been seen as difficult and inaccessible for one reason or another, and therefore people have almost been a little bit scared about it.
Yeah, I think it's because of the skill gap, right? You need to learn new different tools that can be quite scary to use, I guess, at first, right? Picking up a tool like I don't know, take JMeter, right? Now I know JMeter, so I think it's really easy to use now, but thinking back to the first time I looked at it and there wasn't much documentation on it, but at least I couldn't find any, you know. So it's about I knew that I had to use that tool because my team was using that tool and I had to learn it. So it's kind of, I was forced to spend time investigating this tool and finding out how it worked. But if I was just picking it up off my own back, then I think I would have probably binned it. Do you know what I mean? But I'm glad I stuck at it because it's a useful tool again, right?
Yeah, it's kind of that initially steep learning curve thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I imagine the same is for proxies, right? Same as
Yeah,
for proxy tools.
it's not simple. I mean, I guess I may be a little biased because it's certainly the most recent few conferences I've gone to. There's always been a workshop on using proxy tools.
Oh, I know.
But
that's a good
funny.
thing. That makes it more accessible for people to learn, right?
It does. I think it's also quite an easy one to write a workshop around.
It's because it's, even just open up Fiddler and there's so many tabs to it, right?
Right, exactly.
I still don't know what half of them do. And then you open up something like Zap or Burp Suite actually. Burp Suite, I think there's only 2 windows or 3 windows. It's completely different.
Well, you can even do it through the dev tools in Chrome.
Yeah, dev tools are getting so much better now as well. So yeah.
Anyhow,
right. So skills required then, right? If someone's picking up security or performance, right? Where can they go? We've spoke about conferences a little bit. There's a lot to learn at conferences about performance and security, and I'm sure for accessibility and localization and other non-functional requirements as well, right? Or non-functional testing.
Yeah, I mean,
I need to change that term, but not call it something like parafunctional or quasi-functional. Do you know what I mean?
Let's just call it for now security, performance, stress, and load.
And accessibility and localization.
And accessibility and localization. And speed. Hey, I can see why someone came up with non-functional now. Yeah, I mean, from a security perspective, OWASP is clearly the place to go.
Yeah.
Or indeed the rather excellent security testing podcast, Testing the Pub episode, I can't quite remember, with Dan Billing.
Oh yeah, that was great.
Yeah, that's also a very awesome place to learn about security testing.
Shameless plug there, Steve.
Absolutely.
Like
We've not done one specifically on performance testing, have we? That makes me think we should.
No, we haven't. We should. Yeah.
Yeah. Where would you go to learn about performance testing?
I would probably go to YouTube, blogs, the tools themselves, and just do a lot of reading. And then I'd try and reach out to the community and see who's involved in performance testing and have a good chat with them at meetups or stuff like that. So, but then I guess there's risk and value comes into it as well, right? If someone goes and learns all of this stuff and then isn't given the opportunity to test for that sort of stuff in their work, there's a risk there, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I guess it's like anything. You need to look at what the return on your investment is going to be ultimately. Yeah. So, is there scope within the project you're working in, or indeed the career or the next project you wish to work in, or the next role you wish to work in, to actually actively follow this sort of stuff?
Yeah, but also there's risks in the opposite end of not doing it as well. So it's kind of, you have to, I guess, influence and communicate these risks.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because when you talk about something like security, for example, I think sometimes teams don't security test because they're almost afraid of the results, and there's a fair bit of kind of head in the sand behaviour going on. We're not going to do we don't need to do security testing. We're not going to do security testing, and the reality is they're actually probably thinking, what happens if we find a whole bunch of security holes? The risk is low, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
So I think there is definitely an element of being a little bit scared of the results of that, which is something you'd have to take into account if you're trying to influence a team to do more security testing, for example.
I'd say performance more so, because if you find out that the system breaks at 200 users, but you don't have that benchmark, then no one's really going to know whether 200 users is acceptable or not. Someone's going to have to make that judgment call, and product owners, from my experience, some product owners can be reluctant to say whether that's an acceptable level or not, right?
That's an interesting point, yeah. I mean, from my most recent experience, the team were totally on their performance testing, and it was massively important to them.
Yeah.
And they spent a huge amount of time performance testing and load testing prior to launch. But yeah, maybe that's not a stereotypical approach or response.
Yeah, no, well, I'm thinking about, even with speed, right? A single user, if you click on a button and it takes 30 seconds, right? I know people that are product owners that would say the customer would be happy with this 30 seconds because of the processing that's going on in the background, right?
Because they like they like to go and have a nice cup of tea and
yeah, but if it
maybe
was
a
like
biscuit.
a minute, then that's nowhere near acceptable.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like, damn, if it's over 10 seconds, then I'm getting frustrated, right? I need things quick, you know.
You mean you're impatient?
Yes, I'm very impatient, especially when it comes to web pages loading. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean,
frustration.
there are so many studies that show the user drop-off rates, particularly say in e-commerce, the amount of abandoned baskets and so on that happen because things are just purely too slow. There's huge amounts
true.
of research that shows those sorts of issues.
In that sense, should we actually, we should incorporate things like logging and stuff like that to tell us whether our system's performing.
Well, maybe that's it. Maybe that hits the nail on the head, because ultimately, if you can design your exploratory tests, when I say design, I mean have in mind when you test, to take into account that you're trying to uncover performance problems, and then you have good logging in place at the point you do it, then this almost comes for free.
Yeah, it's true. Very good point. Okay, so are there any books? Are there any books on performance? Or we know that there's a few security books. Dan gave us a few last time.
Yeah, I'm sure there are.
Hacker's Handbook and all that sort of
I'm
stuff.
sure there are lots of books. None of them jump to my mind off the top of my head, which is completely unhelpful.
I must admit, I don't know any books on performance testing.
I think we need to do a performance testing in the pub. That's what's quite clearly come out of this discussion.
Yeah, definitely. And also there's a really good blog on accessibility, sort of like to stem ideas on accessibility testing, and also browser plugins as well for accessibility testing. They're useful. There's one for the W3 standards on accessibility that you click a button and it tells you if it's essentially meeting those standards when it comes to tags and like element IDs and things like that. So
exactly. And from a load and a stress perspective, there's a lot of different tools out there, and I think the key thing is research what you feel is best for you. And the key thing for you and I is do a podcast. Put the teeth back in. Do a podcast that's specifically focused around each of these particular non-functional requirements, or non-functional whatever requirements, or whatever you want to call it ultimately.
Yeah, that's what we should just call it.
Yep.
Non-functional requirements, or whatever requirements, or non-functional whatever, or whatever you want to call it.
I thought WTF is NFR was a little bit more catchy.
Yeah, brilliant. So, lastly, maybe we should put a question out to the listeners and say, what do you guys do?
Yes, listener, tell us what you do.
Add a comment and tell us what you think of non-functional requirements, and whether you test them as part of exploratory testing, or whether it's a separate team activity, or maybe even it's your team but just done separately in the process of developing software, you know. So
yeah, absolutely. And if there are any particular tools that you use that you find useful, then tell everyone about it.
Share the knowledge.
Absolutely.
Cool. This has been a good chat.
It
has. The park.
It has. The birds are singing.
We need beer next time. It'll make me feel like home.
Nice. Or Buckfast tonic wine, right?
Oh, I can't get Buckfast anymore on Amazon though. I'll get something next time.
Nice. Look like tramps in the park. Yes, lovely. On that note, I think that's probably a good point to stop this episode of Testing in the Pub. So we will be back very soon.